Hello, everyone. It's so good to see you here. Welcome. My name is Suba Xavier. I'm the interim director of the Institute of African Studies, and this is just such an exciting talk, and I'm just delighted to have you all join us today. So on behalf of the IAS at Emory, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our second among 3 lectures this year by Africa-based scholars. This lecture series was made possible by generous funding from our Dean's Office to build connections between Emory faculty and students and scholars who are doing exciting work on the African continent. Dr. Ismahan Diop's visit in particular was co-sponsored by the Departments of French and Italian, African American Studies, Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies, and the program in Psychoanalytic Studies. So thank you to each of these departments and program for your support. Now, I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker today, Dr. Ismahan Soukeyna Diop, who is Associate Professor of Psychology at the Université Cheikh Anta Diop and has a clinical psychology practice in Dakar. She's also the 2023 Kansas African Studies Center Virtual Affiliate Fellow. Ismahan Diop is author of 2 books, African Mythology, Femininity, and Maternity, which was published in 2019, and Adornment, Masquerade, and African Femininity, published in 2023. Both were published in the Palgrave Macmillan Global Pan-Africa series. These 2 books examine the impact of social, cultural, and mythological representations of womanhood, femininity, maternity, and emancipation on girls' education and women's coping strategies through the lens of decolonial feminist psychology. In addition to these works, she has also written several articles in French, among them one on nervous laughter in psychotherapy and another on maternal enmeshment in West African culture. Ismahan Diop's scholarship grows out of her decolonial feminist approach to her clinical practice in psychotherapy, which seeks out alternative and concomitant models to European psychoanalysis. More specifically, her recent research focuses on the use of African tales and mythology in psychotherapy, and she's founder of TAMSI, Tales and African Mythology in Psychotherapy, which is a toolkit that she's going to tell us about today that earned the American Psychology Association's Psych Solutions Grant in 2020. Since then, TAMSI has grown into a global application, and she's training a new generation of clinical psychologists to use TAMSI from Senegal to Germany, Somaliland to South Africa. She's in the US as part of a growing research collective that is invested in indigenous psychology and the exploration of indigenous techniques in the understanding, conceptualization, and practice of psychology. While her research concerns African and Afro-descendant populations, she's collaborating with Native American practitioners to develop a similar toolkit for Native peoples in the US. We have been fortunate to have Ismahan Diop among us for the last 3 days, during which we have kept her very busy. She participated in graduate seminars in French, WGSS, and African American Studies, and religion in the graduate division of religion. She also met individually with various faculty members and groups of students. So thank you, Dr. Diop, for so much generosity of time and spirit. Her talk today is entitled Tales and African Mythology in Psychotherapy, Rethinking Mental Health from a Decolonial Perspective. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ismahan Soukeyna Diop.
Hi, I'm just gonna take this right away. Hello, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Mike, thank you. So my presentation today will be about how to think psychotherapy from a decolonial perspective. So first, I'm going to introduce myself. So I am a clinical psychologist first. So I grew up in Senegal. I was trained in France and United Kingdom as a clinical psychologist. And then I went to Senegal to work as a clinical psychologist, and I started my PhD and my research on the topic of hysterectomy, mastectomy, and women's status in Senegal, because I was very interested in womanhood, femininity in African cultures. So I started as a scholar at the Université Cheikh Anta Diop, and I was very interested in how, because of our training, we have to replicate some of the information that we have learned into teaching other students some of the things that are not really applicable in our environment. So I tried to find other way to understand those information and how to actually look into more knowledge to build a better teaching for our students. So my research is about womanhood and femininity. When I was working as a clinical psychologist, researching with women after hysterectomy and breast mastectomy, I was really interested in how it affected their status as women, as Senegalese women particularly. And what those women were telling me is that we have many information online about hysterectomy, about cancer, about breast mastectomy, but none of the information really applies to us. For example, information about cancer tells you to eat some of the food that you don't even find in West Africa to get better or to feel better. But we would like to have our own information and actually show our own life, how it's affecting us to have these surgical intervention. So I was really interested in how it was affecting them specifically as women, as African women. And I was really interested in how the images of womanhood and femininity were very important in these images of them as women. And I was interested in African oral tradition because of all the storytelling we have in our cultures in Africa about the tales we tell children about the images of women, for example, the witch, the devouring mother, the benevolent mother, and how it's actually really impacting the way we see women and we see ourselves in society. And then I started working, researching about mythology tales and psychoanalysis. And I found that many of the images that we have in storytelling actually have some specific messages that they're conveying to children, telling them this is the way to behave and this is the way not to behave. And storytelling actually has a strong message in education. And I was analyzing how this message can actually be used to give another way, to give another option to people. So I started using tales in my clinical practice. And this clinical practice inspired me to change the way I approached psychotherapy myself. And working in West Africa and East Africa, in Senegal, in Guinea, in Djibouti, I was interested in all the diversity of approaches that I had with patients, with students, to see how people actually are able to contribute to science, to knowledge in their own way. And I found that we had to use a decolonial lens, meaning to change the way we approach science, to think about science as something that we can actually contribute to as human beings. So I was thinking about indigenous psychology, meaning all the ways people think about what's real, what's not real, what's illness, what's health, what's balance. And thinking about all of this, I started looking into the indigenous psychology in our cultures in Senegal. And I looked closely into Wolof, Lebu, and Serer cultures in Senegal, into how they see reality and what the world looks like in their lens. So it led me to schematize the world in how indigenous psychology is structured in West Africa and in Wolof, Lebu, and Serer cultures. And I called it parallelism because in indigenous psychology, time is not linear. It's not now, before, and after. It's cyclical. Generations comes after one another, and people rename their children after people who have left before, who have had lives, and they take qualities and characters and particularities from these people to repeat a cycle. And the life we live is not isolated from everything that has happened before. And balance, individual balance is not possible without global balance. So in this picture, you can see that in Wolof, Lebu, and Serer culture, we all have a common source of creation. And there is a visible word, like you and me see each other, and there is an invisible word, that's magic creators. And I have the example of Rabs in Wolof culture and Lebu culture. And Rabs are spirits that live at the same time as us, in the same environment. But the way Lebu culture sees Rabs is that Rabs have their own families and they have their own lives, but they live in the same life that that we have. And there is the visible world with us, and there is the invisible world at the same time living in the same environment. This is why I called it parallelism. And this invisible world connects and communicates with this visible world. So people, when they are having mental health challenges, usually when you ask them, what do you think you have? They will tell you, I'm possessed by a rab. It's a spirit from the invisible world. And there is a connection, a constant connection in those two places. Actually, we are in the same places, but in those two dimensions. And the invisible world and visible world have the same common source of creation. Families of Rabs are connected to families of humans. And to keep this connection, we have to keep traditions. We have to keep altars giving offerings. And those altars, they're called hamb. So the hamb is a large baobab tree where the family gives offerings. And it's really connected to nature. It's connected to the way people are tied to land, and they are part of this land, of this nature. So usually, when there is a problem, when there is an unbalance, a health problem, people will tell you this is because we did not keep the balance between the ancient generations and the actual generations. And we have to entertain to keep this link through tradition. And that when there is a disconnection, when someone is sick, he's not isolated because he's sick. He's actually the representative of a disbalance in the community. So the community will connect and make a connection, a communication to have a collective healing. This line that you can see in the middle means that there is a line connecting both words. And traditional healers, they are on this line because they can communicate with both words. There are bridges from the visible and the invisible world, and they are connected to both places, and they can actually make sense of people's experience, giving an explanation. Humans can also use bad spirits to attack other humans, and this is how the invisible world can be source of bad deed, of malevolence. So there is a constant communication between these words in people's experience. And this reality is everywhere in West Africa. You cannot ignore it. You cannot say that it's not real and you cannot believe it, because that's how people feel about reality. And for psychotherapy to make sense, you have to take into account this reality. So humans are part of the ecosystem. They're connected to other elements. For example, the Khams are connected to nature. They have totem, they have plants that are connected to their ancestry because we are all part of the common ancestry. So we are all connected to one another. For example, something like climate change has a real effect on balance, on global balance, because when people are affected in their village, in their place, in their lives, by climate change, the nature is affected and it affects the global balance of society. Collective rituals and cleaning take the whole community together to actually try and connect with ancestry and repeat a cycle. Mental illness is a global dysfunctioning. It's not an individual question. People are drawn to come back to their group and try to make something together to heal. And there is a link with totemism because it's connecting humans with nature, because we all have the same ancestry. In the totemism, like it's called in ethnography and in anthropology, there is a link between the totem and their families, because people are connected in their ancestry with the totem. I have cited a few female archetypes. For example, Mami Wata, she's supposed to be a mermaid in some places because Mawata is close to water, the term, so it's actually why she's called this way. And she's, in some countries, she's a mermaid. In some other countries, she's a woman that comes out of the sea, but she's not called a mermaid. And in every one of those places, she incarnates the seductive woman that takes people's lives if they do not honor their contract with her, but she can grant them money and power. Booty is another representation of how feminine archetypes are actually representative of the link between women and nature, between humans and nature, because she's represented as a hyena in the region of Djibouti. And the name Djibouti actually comes from Booty, this creature that actually inhabited the land before the nomadic settlers came and took the land to live in Djibouti. Arawelo is also another one of this mythical creator. She was a war soldier, a queen living in the region of the Horn of Africa. And according to the legend, when she died, her body disseminated in all parts of the Abyssinian region created the landscape of this region. So in African way of seeing history, ancestry, life, humans are really part of the nature. They're really connected to the land where they live. I took another example of how collective ritual and healing can take place in a community. And the example I took is the one of the Ndup, which is a ritual healing that's performed by Lebu people in Senegal. And I feel like it's important to just describe it for you to understand how traditional healing works and what's really at stake in this type of experience. So the Ndup is a ritual performed to heal people who are possessed by Rab. Rab who are, I have a clear definition of it here. The Rab is an ancestral spirit that takes possession of the subject. So the consequence of this possession is psychological and physical symptoms of the individuals and the people around them. So people will tell you that I have a Rab, but this is why I cannot find a husband or a wife, because everyone who is attracted to me starts feeling sick or having something. So the Rab is making the other people sick, not only the person. So the Rab is supposed to be an ancestral spirit that's connected and that's taking possession of the subject. So it means when there is a Rab, it means that there is an imbalance, and the creators from the invisible world, for some reason, have decided to cross the line and to come invade the environment of the visible world. So this imbalance means that there was something that was done wrong and we have to correct it. But this thing that was done wrong, it doesn't necessarily affect the person who is possessed. Someone else or the generation in the family could be, all the generation can be responsible of what has been wrong, but the person who is sick is actually just showing the problem, is not the problem. So this is why this person is not isolated, because it's not the problem. He's not guilty of being sick. So the individual is a piece of a network, including invisible and visible entities cohabitating through time and space. The dimension of time is different since transgenerational repetition prevails. And the significance of symptoms sometimes can pass on from earlier ages of the family. Envy and jealousy also explain mental illness, since people with bad intention can use dark magic to agitate the invisible world. So the Ndup is a ritual that represents how mythical archetypes are present in the traditional healer's work and overview the process. So before starting the Ndup, the traditional healers ask the mythical creators and the ancestors and the spirits to grant this ceremony and to accept for them to perform this ceremony. And the ritual takes place in a house where everyone who is supposed to be healed comes together, and the whole community participates in the healing. So the way the rap is performed, the way the ndap is performed is that there is a music, there is an intense music going on, because the music invites the rap to just get out of their host's body. And when they get out, they're in the room, in the place, at the same time during the ceremony. But then the ceremony changes, and there is a ritual sacrifice of an animal. And all of the patients, they are connected, they're laying down on the animals and covered by cloths. And then the animal is killed, and the animal's blood is just collected, and they're building a new kham, a new altar. And this ceremony means that they're luring the rab to think that their host body has died, and they're following the host body in the animal. They're following it into the kham, and then they're being locked inside. So the idea of pretending that all of the bodies that were possessed are now being, separated from the animals that's being killed. So actually, behind this ceremony, what the traditional healer is saying is that this collective ritual of everybody participating to this ceremony is actually reconnecting everybody, reintegrating everyone in the community, and performing a collective ritual that reassembles the community and allows everybody to express themselves. So what's specific about the traditional healers model? Individual and collective history brings less guilt and stigmatization, provides an explanation that makes sense, seeks meaning in culture, ancestry, and rites of passage. So the traditional healer, he makes connection between what he's being told as symptoms and experience, and he tries to find an explanation that makes sense for the person. And he underlines the connection between time and space, so he will find an explanation that actually makes sense in the real patient's experience. So I'm sorry that this slide is very crowded, but it's a lot of information that's very necessary for you to understand. So there is a genius psychologist who is working on indigenous psychology in Washington State. He's called Arthur Bloom. And he made this table to compare Western assumptions and Indian indigenous assumptions. And I used the same pattern to make the difference between West African assumptions and Western assumptions. And to understand it, to understand how the model of public health, of mental health, is built and does not really respond to the real actual representation of people in real life in West Africa, in Africa in general, it means that Western assumptions has a way of seeing natural world, reasons for mental health, relationship with healthcare. That's completely different than the indigenous assumptions. For example, in the Western assumptions, the natural world is resources for self-consumption. For example, the nature can give resources that you can use to build a home, and then you can use the resources in the nature to feed yourself. But it's not an environment that's a source of treatment that has a real connection and ancestry with you, as in indigenous assumptions. And reasons for mental illness in Western assumptions, it's decompensation, it's genetic sources. But in indigenous assumptions, it's a lack of balance in the system at large. So indigenous assumptions will try to find an explanation that actually goes above the only individual being. You will try to find a connection with the big ecosystem where the individual is. And it's not a balance only between someone and someone else. It's a balance from one generation to the other generation. It's a balance between visible and invisible, and it's also a balance between human and nature. Relationship with the healthcare system, it's Western assumptions will have the idea that the healthcare system is about education. So people in the healthcare system have degrees and have science that they have acquired through education. But the indigenous assumptions will seek a traditional healer who is a bridge to this invisible world. So his science, his knowledge is to be a bridge through this invisible world. So he knows and he has access to a specific knowledge that's invisible. He's not documented into science, and people do not expect them to be. They expect them to have this sensitivity to be connected to this invisible environment. The implication of the family in the treatment is financial support, it's relays for the medical treatment, but in indigenous assumptions, they're completely included in the treatment as vessels of the ancestors and receptors of the treatment. So they are part of the treatment. They're not just accompanying the patient or paying or supporting or giving medication. They are also being healed in the process. Genealogy and ancestry are also viewed completely differently in both assumptions, and you can see it here. So what's the consequence on mental health care? When the mental health care does not take into account indigenous assumptions and only focuses on Western assumptions, there is a lack of sense and meaning for the patient. The family is not being involved because they're not really connected to the process. They don't make sense in the explanation of the illness. Both treatment in parallel are now communicated because people will keep doing their indigenous care healing, and they will come to the psychologist and the psychiatrist, not telling them that they have something else going on. And the traditional healer is actually not aware of the real treatment that's going on the other side. So if, for example, the person has a treatment that he should take and the traditional healer asks them to fast, for example, it doesn't work together because fasting doesn't go with medication. And lack of communication between both treatment just show and incarnates the lack of communication between both assumptions. And the result is the failure of both treatments. So what's Tamsi's clinical framework? When I started to work as a clinical psychologist, people would come to see me and tell me, hey, I know that I have a rab and I'm possessed by a rab. I'm dealing with it with my traditional healer, but I'm coming to see you because I'm anxious about it and I want to deal with my anxiety. So they have to divide themselves in both assumptions that I showed in the table, and then they divide themselves, they show you the face of Western assumption, and then on the other side, they deal with the other way of thinking life. And they feel like they cannot have a frame that can actually host all of them. What they are, what they feel, how they feel, and what they believe in. So I started to work using storybooks and children's books and just telling them, okay, just tell me how you feel about this story. Just do not feel like you have to apologize for not believing in this or for believing in something else. There is no judgment. Just tell me how you feel about this story. And I felt like tales in psychotherapy are very efficient because people are drawn to just be creative and just tell what comes to their mind. And when they see pictures, they can just say whatever comes to their mind and they don't have to put resistance into it. And community-oriented intervention have proven to be very efficient in public health policies because community-oriented intervention are relayed by groups that actually already used this kind of communication ways, already had strategies that were based in community interventions. So using both together, using storytelling and using it in community setting was already something that could work in a specific environment. But traditional representation of mental health in Africa had to be taken into account. And when you use storytelling and when you show in a story something about magic, people are invited to tell everything they want to say. And they don't have to say, okay, I know this does not exist, but that's the way I feel. So when you put it in some kind of a storytelling, it doesn't make them having to lie or to hide some part of their reality. They can just say whatever comes to their mind and actually be able to be creative about it and think about it in a way that they can feel accepted and can start build an alliance with you as a psychotherapist. So what's the benefit for patients that I've observed? So storytelling reconnects people with their history, ancestry. It's empowering. Therefore, it will be culturally adequate for people of African descent in this specific environment. Using tradition is culturally relevant and it allows projection and free association in psychotherapy. Storytelling with oral tradition is conducting a psychotherapy that makes sense in a traditional systemic approach to the lived experience for the individual and their family. So what does it mean to have a decolonial approach? So I felt like I had to understand how does it work when traditional healers work? I mean, what do they do? Because I needed to understand how are they so much different than psychotherapists, psychiatrists? What do they do that's so different that people have to divide themselves into two people, two persons, to go on one side and have a specific healing technique, and then to go on the other side and see a psychotherapist and a psychologist and be someone else in that other environment. So they seek symbols in mythology and traditions. They try to make sense. For example, someone will tell them, I am feeling this way, and they will say, okay, so this is because your land and your ancestry is connected to this rab. And this rab is seeing how this generation is behaving, and he's not happy with it. And that's the way he's reacting. And then this reaction that you have and you do not control, it means that you're possessed by this rab and you have to do this ritual, this cleaning, so then you can just get your life back. So they seek symbols in mythology and tradition. They respect the indigenous knowledge because they find a way to just connect people with their own history. So a decolonial approach, meaning to find the other way of seeing the way people understand things and actually make sense of the way they see life. For example, when you find the Oedipus complex in psychoanalysis, that's mythology. Oedip is mythology. It's Greek mythology, actually. So if you can draw to Greek mythology to understand an actual 2023 situation in a family, maybe you can get into mythology in African mythology to understand the same situation into now, our actual time. So a decolonial approach, meaning just trying to think about another way to see life using a theory that's actually relevant to people you're looking at. And respect the indigenous knowledge, like if these people think about this and call it this way, maybe there is a reason. Maybe there is a history behind it. Maybe you have to teach yourself to learn about it. And breaking the image of the distant doctor, because traditional healers, they're not distant. They're connected to the population. They're connected to the history. They're not in this perspective of being far away from their clients. They're being central in the therapeutic process. So when you go to the doctor and the doctor is very distant and does not connect with you and has an explanation that's not actually centers with your experience and is just generic about people's experience, you don't really feel like this person is connecting to you individually. So a decolonial approach means really tailoring your understanding of the population, of the person, on themselves and on their singular experience. And accept to learn, because you cannot know everything, and no science can actually explain everything. You always have to learn on specific occasions, specific population and people to understand their specific experience. So what's the benefit for mental health care providers? The way I describe my own experience, and I spoke with other healthcare providers about their experience, and about patients were telling me, I went to this hospital and I saw this doctor and I told him my story. And he said, I understand and I believe you. You should go do your ritual. But here, just let's do the medical thing. Do not, I mean, people will not really understand or believe you. So even the healthcare provider divide themselves into people because they have a face for Western assumptions and they have a face for indigenous assumptions. So when I had to train other psychologists, psychiatrists in Senegal to my way of thinking, well, they were telling me, oh, I feel like there is more consistency between myself and work. And actually, when you put all the assumptions, all the ideas of magic, invisible, into storytelling, you no longer have to think about, is it real? Do you really believe in it or not? Because that's the other question. Do I believe that magic, invisible is true? I don't have to say it. I don't have to think about if I believe in it or not. If it's a storytelling, if it's a story and if it's creative and if it's a tale, I don't have to say where I stand on it. I just have to be creative about it. So it brings a better communication and a stronger psychotherapeutic alliance because storytelling is a game. People get connected to it and to the material and they play with it and they have the place to be creative about it. And also it's empowering. So I have an example of how the colonial approach to psychotherapy is used in this situation. So I will read it. And it's about someone that I called Omar, and I changed the name and the age and the story for anonymity. So in this clinical example, I will show how psychotherapy can help the client to make sense of their experience and take an active role in their life. In the context of indigenous explanation of mental health challenges. So Omar is a 22-year-old young man who starts up psychotherapy when he's expelled from the third school with no degree and has a sad vision of the future. Omar was born at a somber moment of his family's history. A few months before his birth, his 11-year-old sister died of sudden, unexplained illness. A few months, his father attending the first session describes her as their bright, beautiful child that they never have stopped mourning. According to him, this grieving might be connected to his son's incapacity to learn in school because no one was really available to welcome him into the family at the moment of his sister's death. Although Omar witnesses his father's speech, he has another explanation for his condition and waits for him to leave the room to share it. So what Omar tells me is that apparently in his mother's family, they have Tur. Tur is a family of rap that's connected to a family of human. So it's a common ancestry that we've had from generation to generation. And to entertain, to keep this link, this connection safe, they have to keep their tradition and offering to their homes. So this condition is the manifestation of the fact that they have abandoned their homes and did not honor their ancestors. According to him, the Tur are angry and he's possessed by a rab from his ancestral family. His mother knows it and he has contacted her family back at the village to organize these sacrifices. But his father refuses to pay the price, claiming that he does not believe in this explanation. Knowing this, Omar engages into every learning project with pessimism because he knows that he does not have the potential. Indeed, when he reads directions or perform actions, he's lost and never knows where to start. So when people have this kind of deficiency, difficulty, disabilities, it's explained sometimes by the fact that the spirit is taking them back, is not allowing them to learn, is sucking the intelligence out of the person. So that's a sign of possession. Understanding that Omar might have a developmental disorder that have impacted his learning, I advise him to seek a diagnosis from a psychomotor and a speech therapist. Unsurprisingly, he's diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia. Omar welcomed this diagnosis as a long overdue justice for his years spent in school, where he could never explain why he did not perform like his peers. During the psychotherapy, using Tamsi's storytelling tool, we explore his imagination and representation of his family members and peers. The narration process allows his appropriation of the present moment. Indeed, as his father explained, Omar being born in the moment when his family was grieving, he was never integrated and given a place in the family's history. He never really understood his condition. Neither did his family, still shocked by his sister's disappearance. They were silenced by the fear of the invisible forces allegedly responsible for his sister's death, and his existence was conditional, never taken for granted. Everything about him was left to the realm of invisible forces. So everything that went wrong about Omar was never diagnosed or looked into. They didn't go to a doctor or psychologist or a speech therapist before because they thought that it was something that was connected to the invisible forces that actually took his sister before. And they were so traumatized that they could not go into it. Everything about him was left to the realm of invisible forces, and his parents' trauma prevented them to take action. This diagnosis reintroduced a long-lost conversation where he starts to question his rap's wills and behavior. Indeed, Omar sees his present when he has a girlfriend because the rap is jealous and creates conflict in the relationship. And eventually, they break up. In this lonely history of Omar, the rap is a constant partner that was always there and whose love is unconditional. Because actually this attachment to the rap was the only consistent relationship that was bringing attention to Omar, that was always complete with him. Omar is not convinced of his own willingness to perform the ritual and be separated from this entity. The bond is the most remarkable demonstration of love he has ever experienced. Suffering from an attachment disorder of the relationship with his parents, his connection to the invisible world has given him the attention he needed. The role of psychotherapy was to reinstate a sense of self and negotiate a space in the family while they perform their rituals as they wish. So this example shows how actual representation in indigenous psychology makes sense in the personal experience and can be analyzed to references, symbolic information that we can get with the conversation, through the conversation with the family. So what's the stage of development of Tamsi? Training have started in psychiatric facilities, and people start, social workers and nurses start using Tamsi to connect with people and do psychoeducation and talk to them about how they explain their situation and how they have to keep going in psychotherapy, in psychiatry, to keep the treatment going. Because the problem is that for some chronic psychiatric illness, when the treatment is not respected, the consequences are very heavy. For example, in bipolar disorder or schizophrenic disorder or other primary psychotic disorders, when the patient starts and stops taking medication, the consequences are very, very alarming, very grave on their situation, because every time they have decompensation, it's very hard for them to just get back to their previous status. And there is a huge consequence on their own safety, on their family's safety. So the role of TEMSI was to find a way to connect with people's reality and maintain medical treatment in place for them not to fall into degradation of their mental health. The use of psychotherapy, the use of TEMSI in psychotherapy is more like a participative approach. People are connected to their patient, trying to make sense of their experience, and psychotherapists participate in the process of creating a possible new history for people's life, making new choices, finding a way to think about themselves differently. As a conclusion, what I can say is that traditional healing is based on beliefs that structure people's reality. Psychotherapy can analyze this reality and use it as a lever for the treatment. Decolonizing psychotherapy means working on our understanding of science and accept all contributors to science. Community healing is essential to global sustainability and balance. And to finish, indigenous psychology is globally and historically present in all cultures. Here are some references from different places, from different, that you can take pictures of if you want to have more information. And thank you.
Okay, so now I would like to thank you so much. Is Dr. Diop, that was so enlightening and beautifully done. I think we probably have a lot of questions, and I want to bring the microphone over to you because we are recording this. And so in order for your voice to be on the recording, you need to be in the microphone, if you don't mind. So if you have a question, please let me know and I'll come over to you. And if you can answer from that microphone, that would be wonderful. Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. It was very helpful and meaningful to me as a psychotherapist. And I want to bring up a question that was in conversation that I had recently, and you're going to remember this conversation. And it comes back to the Western assumption versus the indigenous assumption and approach, and how we live with those that we're working to treat or to heal. And I want to know your perspective. In Western culture and graduate school, we're taught that there has to be the separation between you and the person you're treating. So when you're out in the world, when you see them, you can acknowledge them if they acknowledge you first, but then you shouldn't be necessarily in that same place, that establishment where your client or your patient is. Can you speak to what the indigenous approach is when you're out in community with someone that you've been working to heal, and how you approach that situation and interact with them?
Maybe just go to the microphone. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for your question. The way I see it, I'm not an indigenous therapist. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I can only try and learn from everything I can find. So when I see traditional healers doing their work, because I mean, this comes from a personal experience. When I was a graduate student, I was in a work placement in a public hospital in Dakar, and I had one of the patients that I was having in the hospital was a traditional healer. So he came to sessions and he says, I'm feeling very anxious and very stressed about my work, because people are expecting me to be competitive and to be able to help them all the time. And sometimes I feel like I'm getting too much anxiety from this, because I'm using myself as a bridge between them and their problems and everything. And it's overwhelming sometimes, and I don't know what to do about it. So I felt like it's not because we don't work using the same science that we cannot understand each other. We have a language that actually can really communicate, really interfere. But what we know about our own beliefs, the way we feel as people, and the way we feel as therapists is not really, it's not so different. Because the way I learned clinical psychotherapy can I have the other? Thank you. The way I learned clinical psychotherapy in university is that teachers told us, when you have a patient in front of you, it's no longer you. You borrow, they borrow your mind. You extend their minds so they can have more space to think. So it's no longer about you. It's not supposed to be about you. If it is about you, then you're wrong. It's supposed to be about more space for someone to think. So whatever it is about indigenous assumptions or Western assumptions, it doesn't matter how you think about what's good, what's not good in your personal life. It's about how you give space to someone to symbolize something, and then they can use your mind as a space to transfer their situation, their dreams, their lives. And you have to help them find their own language. Understanding what this word means for them, what this concept means for them. And whatever the language is, you have to help them make sense of it. I don't know if I answered your question.
Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I heard I'm from Zambia, and in the capital city, certain mental health disorders that are highly prevalent among adolescents include substance use disorders. And I really enjoyed hearing about the Diop example and the RAB example, but I'm curious if you have any examples that combine both indigenous assumptions, like in your experience, if you've come across any examples where clients or patients are trying to quote unquote treat themselves with substances, and how treatment with both indigenous and the Western, how that looks like.
I'm sorry, I'm going to try respond to you, but I think maybe I missed part of your question about if both problem were drug abuse and medication through traditional healing, or medication through psychiatric treatment and drug abuse.
Primarily drug abuse, substance abuse, people self-medicating or not taking prescribed medications, but either consuming alcohol or drugs if they're feeling depressed, anxious, and the like, and how treatment using decolonial approaches looks like.
Okay. I believe that it's a broader question that's more connected to public health than only psychology, I think, because the problem with psychiatric treatment is that medication is super expensive. It's very, very expensive. It's much more expensive than sometimes drugs can be, or alcohol can be. So people who cannot, have consistent access to medication. No one from a lower class situation facing mental health challenges can have the potential to pay for a lifetime of medication if you have, for example, schizophrenia. This is very expensive compared to the usual money you can get every month working. This is knowing that you cannot maybe keep a job if you have this kind of disease. So someone else in your family is paying for that. And this person is maybe not being able to work because they have to take care of you. So it's a broader public health problem about mental health, about the strategies of public health we have in place for mental health care in hospitals, in places. I think that substance abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse are a society problem that we can find in many, many places. But there are some places where they have explanations for a state where you can put yourself to feel some other dimensions or the other ways. And for example, my colleague from Native American indigenous psychology, he has run a lot of research on how before in other dimensions, of science, other people could think that actually, for example, in psychoanalysis, what we call a delirium can be in another culture, can be called a vision. And people can feel like having a vision is positive because it can actually tell you something about the future, for example, give you information about reality that you can only document with this vision. And you can actually make sense of this vision through this experience. So using drugs to get to this level might sometimes be a motive for people, but it also falls into public health difficulties, problems that makes drug, alcohol, and other medication that are used as drugs, but are medications, a public health issue, because I think it's a quite broad, general issue that is actually threatening for every society. But when we speak about indigenous psychology and how indigenous traditional healers sometimes can use some substance to be in specific states, we can think of it in different ways. For example, during the Ndap for Serer and Lebu, for Lebu people in Senegal, there is a rhythm, a music, and people are in trance. I don't think that this specific state where they are, if it was not during this specific experience, they would not be accepted socially to be behaving in this specific situation. It's because this experience hosts this dimension of self that we are able to behave like this. So everything is really connected to the context where it's placed.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Diop. I have a question regarding your methodology, because you said like you are developing also, you are working with indigenous people in the US to trying to develop your methodology. And I was thinking, so you use like mythology, but do you use also, for example, like, because like in the US, for example, like Native people, like they suffer from like colonialism, etc. And so do you take also into consideration like historical trauma? Also thinking, I don't know, for example, like for American people, like the trauma regarding like slavery, this kind of like historical trauma, like do you include them in your methodology, in your work also, like when you work with patients? I don't know if it's clear what I try to say.
Oh, okay. So we haven't started technically working in this field. We have started thinking about using the same framework or thinking to develop a similar approach in indigenous Native American psychology, indigenous psychology. My colleague has been working on indigenous psychology for a long time here, but we haven't really put in place a method for working with this population. We have theorized it. We have started to think about how to implement it and how to develop a larger research. but we haven't targeted specific issues that we would like to intervene on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Diop. This was a very insightful presentation. I was wondering what's the impact of religion? I understand Senegal is predominantly Muslim. So I was wondering what was the impact of this religion and how does it play in the mainstream perception of dispossessions and indigenous knowledge systems? What are the attitudes between indigenous psychology and Muslim spirituality in the context of mental health?
Well, Senegal is a country that's true, predominantly Muslim, statistically, but Islam has found these beliefs, and these beliefs have stayed, even if Islam is here. For example, when we say traditional healers, there are religious traditional healers, and there are other traditional healers from different ways of thinking. There are traditional healers in the Lebus culture, there are traditional healers in the Serer culture, in the Jola group, there are other traditional healers, and each of them have their way of performing according to their traditions. What I can say about how religion is implied, I mean, some of the traditional healers who are religious traditional healers will use religious media. For example, they will read what they can see from the invisible world through some specific prayers that they will say. And they will give as a medication to the patient some prayers that they will use, write on papers, wash in water, and the patient will have to clean themselves with this water. So it's a media. The religion is a language they use to work, but it comes and just embraces this previous thinking that was there before this religion.
One size fits all, like there's set tales that you tell, or you create a tale in every case? If the story you do to get, to bridge the universe of the patients to where you want to talk.
Okay, so with Tamzi, I started with 3 tales that were actually tales I analyzed in my previous work. I only kept 3 of them, and these are tales that exist. I mean, these are tales that I found in literature and I analyzed. For example, one of them is original from East Africa. It's about a boy who is starving and who is in the desert because he went out to find food for his family, who is very poor. And he finds a cow, and this cow is magic. And the cow invites the boy into its body for food, and she gives him a lot of food, and then she gives food to his family as well, because she allows him to take food and bring it to his family. And then when he brings the food to his family continuously, the family starts being suspicious about where the food is coming from. And his elder brother is very jealous of him because he's a savior of the family and he's the youngest, so he's supposed to be the older brother is supposed to be the savior, so he's jealous. So one day they're following him, and then the child realizes it. So he asked the cow to invite his whole family into their body because he wants them to see that he's not fooling them, he's being honest with them. So the cow accepts, but the older brother, once inside the cow's body, is angry and he wants to kill the animal because he wants to bring the animals to his family and say, I killed the animal, so I'm bigger, I'm the best in the family. So the problem is that when he starts hitting the cow with a knife, the boy and his other brothers get out of the animal quickly enough to not be killed in the process. But the older brother dies with the animal because when the animal dies, he's how can I say that? When the animal dies, he's just imprisoned in its body and he cannot get out. So the tale is just connecting to many images. The first one is rivalry in siblings. The second one is relationship between mother and child, because he has to go inside the cub's body and the body has everything he's dreaming about. The other point is abandonment. How could this child be lost in the desert by himself? What's the responsibility of the family? And the other one is the willingness to be seen socially as the one who succeeds. And all of these points, when people see the images and read the story, they start talking about the situation. They start saying, oh, it reminds me of my brothers. They're always jealous of me. Actually, I think that because they're jealous, this is why I got sick, because they're jealous of me and this jealousy has made me sick. So all of these images, they're making them connecting to something they know, something they've experienced. I have two other stories that I also took from tales that exist. And I just picked them because I felt like after analysis, they were the ones that were targeting specific issues that I could observe in people's speeches.
So it's not a story it's not a new story for every patient. It's just tales that you use.
It's three story, and it's always the same three stories. People can just imagine other ways to say that story, to tell the story, but the story exists and they're in books, they're published, they exist. It's just how images of these stories can arouse feelings in people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question about your distinction between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Because I felt like you mentioned it at the beginning somewhat, and then I felt like we were more into psychotherapy, clinical psychotherapy, and psychiatry. So what is the place of psychoanalysis in your work, or in your opinion, in Senegal, and thinking about indigenous practices? Because it is different, from my experience. Thank you.
So, I mean, psychoanalysis is a method of investigation. It's a way of seeing, of performing, and there are different ways of psychoanalysis. There are different ways of psychoanalysis in interviews, the way you position yourself as the analyst and where the patient is, and the way the patient's, the way you analyze the patient's speech or behavior. But clinical psychotherapy can be inspired by the analysis ways of psychoanalysis. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist. I work with psychiatrists. I'm a clinical psychologist. So the way I see psychoanalysis is like a frame of understanding of specific context. So theories of psychoanalysis can be just used to understand certain specific aspects of what the psychic system is, how it works. For example, specific authors in psychoanalysis have brought specific theories that can be used to actually understand some specific tales. What does it mean? For example, for the devouring mother, if you use the Kleinen theory, you can understand it as a representation of the somoic maternal superego. That's useful to understand how people react to the story, to understand where it puts them in their representation of their relationship to their mothers. It could be used as a frame of understanding, but the exercise of psychoanalysis is not, I mean, when you are a psychotherapist, you have different ways of choosing how you conduct the interview. If you're completely silent, if you ask questions, if you ask some questions and you let run the association. But Tamzi uses the free association when it comes to talk about these stories, because people just start mentioning how they feel about an image, and then they go with their own mind, their own feelings, and how they start going from one idea to another idea. And that's free association. The way you analyze a dream, for example. Did I answer?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I came a little bit late, so I apologize if I asked something that you explained at the beginning. I really appreciated how earlier you explained the consequences of dissonance or imbalance on the individual who is experiencing the symptoms that they're seeking care for, imbalance within the individual as well as in their mortal and metaphysical environments, as well as imbalances between their different care systems, the indigenous spiritual ones and the more Western-rooted medical care systems. So I'm thinking in terms of restoring that balance and practicing decolonial psychology, that it's necessary to reckon with the space that colonization and colonial epistemologies and institutions have taken up in the world of the individual, and restructure that space in order to make more space for the indigenous epistemologies and care systems. So you mentioned that part of your work is doing psychoeducation for the community of care seekers. Is there also a component of education in spiritual sciences and traditions for the care providers, so that even if they are receiving that care, that kind of care from the traditional healers, the care providers they're seeing in a medical setting or a psychiatric setting are able to hold what they're or like maybe fully understand what they're speaking about more comprehensively? Let me know if that does not make sense.
It does make sense. It does make sense. But what I can say about it is that I do not interfere with what traditional healers or traditional education means for people. What I do is keep doing my work as a clinical psychologist. That's what I've learned, and that's where I work. But what I say is that I never tell people that what they believe about their symptoms, about their knowledge, about how they feel about their disease does not exist. I work with everything I can get from the patient, and I take all the content they bring to the table. But I do not, have a distancing or condescending approach to indigenous psychology. I know it's around us. I know everybody has in their mind this idea, and I respect it. I do not like when people come to see me and say, this has happened because it's this. I don't touch it. I don't say, are you sure? Maybe it's, no. I don't touch this information. I say, okay, how do you feel about it? Because my work is for people to feel like it's a safe space where they can think and work with their mind to find explanation and symbolize their experience for it to be accepted. So the indigenous psychology will always be here. It was here long before us. So there is nothing we can do to just replace it or change it. There is epistemic violence in the idea that you tell people it doesn't exist, it's in your mind. This is epistemic violence. Because even when we think about psychoanalysis and psychology, the way psychology brings ideas of what's the psychic system and how it works, it's actually inviting to thinking out of this box that I forgot something because I just forgot. Maybe you forgot because you had a motivation to forget about it. So that's already an idea that there is something going on that you do not control, that's out of your control. So that's already an idea of not being able to just to just feel the reality and touch it and feel that this is the only explanation. But psychology and psychoanalysis are sciences that have historically been used to actually undermine indigenous knowledge. So decolonial thinking is to just get back to another perspective, just take another stand and look at the situation and say, okay, so for example, the idea of what the development is that everyone should be independent to be able to work and have money and be a consumer in society. But here is climate change. And we are not sustainable. It doesn't work, actually. So how can we think about another way to see that we are not just here to just take advantage of what's here? We are here to be part of a system, and it works at every stage, every place in the system. Everyone is in a network, and whatever we do has a connection, has a consequence. So indigenous psychology works the same way. We are part of a system, and there is a network. And if you take an individual and just think about them as individually, you do not really take the whole experience into account. You don't really understand why they are here, why they're feeling like this. For example, if you see a family in West Africa and you see a child and they have come to see you because a teacher has asked them to come, and you don't ask, for example, the child, who was he named after? I mean, his name is this, but who is this person? Because that's really relevant in Africa, in West Africa, because you name someone after someone. So when you name someone after one person, it means that there was something to be explained about this choice. So, for example, when you use this interpretation, this idea in clinical psychology, there are many other things than just individual self that you have to take into account when you think about being a psychologist in a place. So indigenous psychologists will still be working, doing their work, but psychologists, to be able to be effective in their situation, because sometimes indigenous psychology tell people, okay, go to the hospital. I can only pray for you, but just go to the hospital. Because like indigenous psychologists, like therapists, traditional healers, they have children who goes to school, to university. They have a life like you and I do. And they know that their application of their theories is not isolated from anyone, from the other people around them. So I don't think that the other actors in the healthcare system should think that way. We are all living in the same environment and sharing the same word. So science has to be able to just host every way of making and contributing to it.
Any other questions? I think I want to ask you one last question, because you, in your slide, there were the three women. There's Buti, there's Mamiwata, there's Harawala, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit, when you look at the tales that come from the Greek mythologies and the women as they're represented in those mythologies versus the tales that you're thinking about and the way femininity and women are, what are some of the lessons for you that are perhaps most important that you bring into an indigenous practice of psychotherapy?
I think the way I understood those tales, those legends, those myths about Buti, Aruelo, and Mamiwata, is that these archetypes, they represent fears humanity has towards womanhood. And in society, we can see it through women's emancipation, when in some situations women are successful, sometimes they're criticized for being successful. So this idea of this fear of femininity and womanhood is still very, very present in society. So I try to understand how we could actually see it in psychotherapy. So I was having female patients and speaking with them about how they felt about their status, how they felt about society towards their success. I could see how the social representation of the fact that they were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. So there was always a narrative about people are telling me to do this, but that's not the way I'm doing this. That's not the way I feel that I would like to be doing this. And there is always pretending to be doing the right thing and then doing something else to be free of having this right to do it. So I felt like these archetypes were very relevant in the fact that they show extremes, examples not to follow, because Mami Wata is bad. She kills people. She's a demon. Aruelo was bad because she wanted to have power for long term, and she was killed for her and for her descendants to just restore a balance. And female archetypes in history, in mythology, are always described as powerful and evil. So I saw how in storytelling, there's always a female character. And you can actually see it in European storytelling. The female character is always very submissive. She's a princess and she's waiting. She's submissive and she's waiting for someone to come and save her. And that's only at the moment when someone comes and saves her that her life starts. Then she starts being a person in the story. So this idea of chaotic representation of womanhood connected to power is very present in storytelling. And the way I saw that I could use storytelling to talk about it with women among my patients, were to just find a way to just analyze how they would behave in the storytelling if they have the liberty to do it. Like they saw the picture and they said, I would do this and that, because that's how they feel like they are free to just show other ways of thinking. And the storytelling allows a space of projection that allows liberty to just think about something creative, about how you can do with this material. Did I answer?
Thank you so much. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've given us so much to think about, so much to take with us. So thank you once again. And please feel free to come up and talk to Dr. Diop in the next little while. We'll be here. We have this room for a few more minutes, so please take advantage. Thank you.